So our second panel for today is called Purity and Mixture, and I will be serving as moderator and discussant. My name is Sebastián Gil-Riaño. I'm an assistant professor here in the History and Sociology of Science department. And our first speaker is Projit Mukherjee, who is an associate professor also in the History and Sociology of Science department. And I will turn things over to Projit.
So, thanks, Sebastian. I would like to start by thanking Dorothy for putting this together and also for bringing us all together more generally through PRSS. It's been wonderful to have such productive conversations around race and its more global presence. I would also like to thank Iram, of course, for being such a wonderful host with everything. Okay, so I'm an associate professor here in the History and Sociology of Science, and my interest generally is twofold. One is to think about how race travels, so not raced bodies, but how the notion of race travels, particularly through things like caste. So I work on South Asia. When you put, is caste race, is it not, is a highly contentious and complicated issue. So that's one of my concerns. And the second one, to go back to what Pamela ended the last panel with, that these determinations of sameness and difference seem to be something no one likes, at least none of my friends like, and we demonize it, but it also seems to be such a fundamental thing that's always going on. And so are there other ways of thinking about human difference that does not lead to race? So these are the two things that I've been trying to think of. And in thinking of this, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is how does racial identity and religious identity relate to each other? I mean, we generally, I think some of us would say that both are social constructs. Others would say that no, race is all about like how you look and bodily things, whereas religion is a matter of faith. However, there have been at least two very major moments in the history of our recent past where these two things have got conflated. So the first is, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust, and the second, unfortunately, is the moment we're living through, which is this global Islamophobia. And I would like to underline the fact that this, perhaps thanks to the new media landscape we live in, is way more global than we often appreciate, this moment of Islamophobia. It's not just something that the White House does, which of course it does, but at the same time, it's also, if you look at the massacre of Rohingyas in northern Burma or Myanmar, the horror that unfolds every day in Kashmir, the lynching of Muslims in Sri Lanka, it's happening all over the place. And this is, again, this conflation of religion and race in a bizarre way. And so thinking about this, this is happening a lot through new ideas of genetics that we've already been hearing about. But I'm a historian, so I want to take a slightly longer view of this, and particularly I'll be focusing on South Asia and see how these two things have racial identity and religious identity have often got connected to each other. And for this, I have a very specific site in mind, and that site is the missing foreskin. Now, it's a matter of some historical irony, perhaps, that the two groups that have been most affected have been at the receiving end of this racialization of religion in the recent past. The Jewish people and Muslim people have both been marked by this one bodily marker of faith, circumcision, or the missing foreskin. As Sander Gilman puts it, the foreskin is not just a cultural fact, it's a site upon which different kinds of value are accreted. And so what I'm presenting to you here is what I would call maybe a tragedy in 4 acts. The tragedy begins in the aftermath of the Second World War, when, as many scholars, including many of you in this room, have pointed out that race is kind of resuscitated through genetics. Genetics as eugenics past is sort of wiped clean. Instead of a language of race and essences, we develop a new language of populations and statistical frequencies, and this gives race or populations a new career in this post-Second World War period. And it's in this moment that I pick up my story. And it's through a discussion in the medical journal, The Lancet, in 1953. And I call this first act, Mother Nature Speaketh. Well, it started with a letter written by a doctor in New Zealand asking about whether it was good to have young baby boys circumcised or not. Sir Daniel Whiddon, who had served in Tunisia during the war as a brigadier in the British Imperial Army, wrote a rather long reply to this, in which he said the distribution of circumcision over the surface of the globe is irregular and can be traced to the influence of race. The conqueror imposing the practice on his subjects, circumcision is universal in the Semitic races and has been taken up by the Arab to all the seacoasts of Africa and by the Jew to all parts of the world. He continued that it's actually unhealthy, that there is nothing, that it actually leads to further health complications. He said that, but it's widely practiced because it's the medicine of the jungle and the witch doctor, the teaching of the Bible and the Quran, the traditional science of the midwife, the health visitor, and the modern home health dictionary. Whiddon continued that if you were to ask a young mother who was not the gramophone record of somebody else, like he has these just off-the-cuff misogyny all over what he writes. So he calls young mothers silly things in other parts of the piece. But he continues, and he has recourse to this idea of nature. He says, if you ask her if she thinks it likely that nature would bring 1,000 English children into the world every day, well-formed in all respects except this one, if it is not more likely that nature is right and the folk medicine that tries to improve on her is wrong. So his point was, if circumcision was really good or necessary, then nature would do it herself. Since there is a foreskin, obviously it's the right thing to do, and you can't get rid of it. Now, not everybody agreed with him. There were a spate of letters. There were about 20-odd letters that came in for this. So it was a big debate in Lancet, which is one of the main medical journals at this point, at least within the British world. So Theobald Stewart, who had actually served under Sir Daniel in Tunisia, and at this time was a GP in New Zealand, said, do not take Sir Daniel's advice to ask a young mother if she thinks it likely that nature would bring 1,000 English children into this world every day, well-formed in all respects. He goes on to say that basically if you use that logic, then what about the appendix? What about tonsils? What about all these other things which are perfectly natural, but are not only, by the medical wisdom of that time at least, are not only unnecessary, but in some cases also dangerous. So he says that if you take toenails, appendix, and mastoids are his three examples. He says these are all perfectly natural, and yet they're dangerous or at least pointless. So this whole idea that Mother Nature has a logic and that's right is complete bunkum. So Stewart doesn't agree, but there's another letter that comes in from Dr. Akil Qadir, who's from Pakistan, but at this point working in a hospital in Manchester. And he writes that it is not, as Sir Daniel implies, unknown to find babies born without the prepuce. Quite a few examples can be collected. Some families are known to contain individuals without the prepuce in successive generations. He then goes on to say that in South Asia, he knows of several families where over multiple generations, young children are born without the foreskin. So this is another kind of response. So the first response is simply that you can't use this Mother Nature logic. There are all kinds of other things which are useless. But Dr. Qadir writes back and says that, well, we do know that in some cases Mother Nature is circumcising kids. There are these cases of congenital circumcision. And so congenital circumcision, this is initially thought of as being the first medical report on this phenomena that comes to be called congenital circumcision. Another doctor, Theodore James of South Africa, from the Cape Province, who had also incidentally worked in Manchester, he too writes in and says, although nature's constancy is not to be denied, on occasions she has wondered whether the foreskin is really necessary. And he actually points to several other cases which he met with. And he says in one case at least he had found 3 generations of a family had inherited inherited congenital circumcision. So James and Kadir both, and Stewart, all of them are pretty sarcastic about Sir Daniel as well. So one of the things that's happening to this idea of Mother Nature is I think Mother Nature worked long enough she was a twin of Britannia, if you will, the personification of empire. As long as there was an empire, as long as there was a high command that could tell you that this is what Mother Nature says, these are the natural laws, it was all fine. Now in the 1950s, it was a moment of decolonization. All these countries were breaking up. Nobody cared for Sir Daniel and his imperial title. They were writing back and saying, you're wrong. Some of them were saying, oh, he's just like an old crank who's just full of self-importance. And which is kind of correct. But the fact that these imperial doctors in some backwater in New Zealand, in Pakistan, in the Cape Province, had the confidence to write back and call him out was a matter of this moment of decolonization. And with it, I think, with this moment of decolonization, what's happening is it's becoming increasingly difficult to speak of a single nature. People are interpreting nature differently. Somebody is saying that, no, nature says this, nature says that. Somebody's saying, I don't even believe in this thing called natural laws. We just have to use other frameworks. So this idea of Mother Nature starts crumbling along with empire in the 1950s. So this is where I switch to my Act 2, Mother Nature's post-colonial daughters. So one of the things that comes out of this demise of Mother Nature are these new, again, something we've already been hearing about in the previous panel, these new genetically defined populations. That there's no one size that fits all, but there are these different particular sizes that might fit different people. And so there are these kind of groups that are increasingly called genetic isolates, that they're isolated from one another. And again, there's been a lot of work on this idea of isolates. But most of the studies of isolates have looked at geographically isolated populations. Particularly interesting and politically very significant have been the recent studies of so-called primitive people who have been identified, or tribal people who have been identified as being genetically unique. However, that was not the only type of genetic isolate that was being discussed in the 1950s. Another type was the religious isolate. And this is Bentley Glass, an American geneticist, comes up with this notion. He says, actually, using primitives or quote-unquote primitives or these geographic isolates only has limited value because you don't know what's really causing their adaptations. It might be they're just adapting to different environments differently. What would be really useful is if we could find particular groups sharing exactly the same environment and still genetically isolated. And so that happens with religious isolation. And Bentley Glass takes up cases such as the Dunkers, the Amish, and various kinds of small, isolated American churches, and starts treating them as religious isolates. Now, he doesn't, I should confess to my great chagrin, he does not try to use circumcision as a marker of this isolation. Perhaps because at this point in the mid-20th century, by some estimates, over 95% of adult American males were actually circumcised. So it wasn't a very useful marker. It was something that everybody probably had. And, but Glass's idea of having this kind of a religiously defined genetic isolate catches on, and it travels to South Asia. So we start getting, from the end of the 50s, a spate of studies studying how Hindus and Muslims, or Parsis and Muslims, are genetically distinct. So the first one is this study by P.N. Bhattacharjee, studying Brahmins in Bengal and comparing them to Bengali Muslims. You get a similar study in Karachi that studies Muslims and Parsis. And you have a number of these studies coming out from the 50s and 60s, which for the first time are not using geographical isolation. They're not using this notion of tribal studies were also very common in South Asia, but these are not those. These are taking people who are neighbors and saying, but they're still genetically isolated because they belong to different religions, so they must have a separate gene pool because they've only been married within their groups for a very long time. So religion here starts getting played out through this idea of the religious isolate in genetic terms. However, this moment of this genetic definition of religion has, I should mention before moving to my third act, that there's only one place where I've seen actually at this point people using circumcision in these religious isolation studies, and that's actually in Arnhem Land in Australia, where there is an attempt to see whether those groups which practice circumcision and those groups which do not practice circumcision, to use circumcision as a kind of boundary marker to see what genes flow across that marker. So is there a specific type of genetic pool that you can constitute by all those who practice circumcision versus those who don't? So there is this kind of study going on. However, this 50s moment, my Act 3 is a kind of flashback. Any good movie has a flashback to bring you up to speed. So it's a flashback, and I call it forgetting Lamarckism, because it's not as if congenital circumcision had not been known. So Theodore James and Dr. Kadir and all these people who are saying that this is the first report, it's not true, because there have been reports of congenital circumcision, particularly by Eugene Talbot, a Chicago doctor who had collected information from 3 Chicago rabbis in the 1880s. And his data was actually published quite widely, including in the JAMA. So it was quite well known. And in fact, there was even a word that Talbot didn't coin, but it came about in the wake of Talbot's research, called apostheo, the absence of the prepuce. And it was in popular medical dictionaries in the 50s as well. So people should have known about this. So this whole presentation that congenital circumcision is unknown is somewhat disingenuous. And I still don't exactly know why this forgetting is happening, but this is precisely the moment when a new molecular synthesis of Darwinism is being constructed, the so-called new synthesis. And probably the older case reports of congenital circumcision were too closely linked to Lamarckian theory to be even mentioned at this point. But this still requires some work. This is a kind of a ghostly presence, if you will, in the 50s. So finally, my last act is the circumcised soul. And here I want to talk about, so like I said, that going back to the comment that Pamela ended with, that there is, after all, are there other ways of thinking of difference that does not lead up to this? Are there other ways of it? Because we seem to be always doing this, difference and similarity. But does it necessarily have to be genetic? Or are there other ways of doing it? And this is what I was looking for when I found these rather interesting group of scientists in South Asia who were nominally in parapsychology departments, but what they were really researching was rebirth, reincarnation cases. And they created a database of over 5,000 cases of reported reincarnation. And they try to study this scientifically instead of religiously. And there are some very interesting cases in this. So, some of these cases involve congenital circumcision. For instance, there's the case of one of the first cases is that of a young boy called Mukul Bhausar. He belonged to the Rangres or the Dyer caste in central India, born in a small little obscure village. But he claimed not only did he not have foreskin, he claimed that he could offer namaz, which is the Muslim prayer, before he could clearly speak. He refused to partake in the rituals of his Hindu family, and he claimed once he could speak, he claimed that he was actually a man called Alauddin who had died a few years back in a neighboring village and who was known to be a pious Muslim man. These kind of cases keep coming up. And what is interesting is that they're not just in South Asia. There are cases in Lebanon. So this book, Qissat Taqabbus, is from Lebanon. It tells you the stories of reincarnation. It's a collection of cases. They're found in southern Turkey. They're found in Egypt. There are some cases in Nigeria amongst the Igbo. And what is interesting is we have a certain notion of Cold War science, which is all about big dams and nuclear bombs and espionage. But there's a weird kind of Cold War science going on here, that these scientists all make connections with each other. They go to Nigeria, they go to Turkey, My friend Harun just found me a whole book of 500 letters exchanged between a Turkish scientist and an Indian scientist trying to study these cases. And so there's a completely different take of, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to argue that, and they're taking on geneticists head on, and they're trying to argue that genetics can't explain who you are, they can't explain human difference, and genetics can't even explain physical deformities, or if you, I don't know if I should call it deformity, but congenital circumcision being one of them. They're also interested in other kinds of disabilities. And they say that all of these go together with the inheritance of some kind of non-material basis of personhood, which they don't want to use the word soul. They're very cagey about the word soul. So they, for a long time, they use the word extra, or the phrase extracerebral memory. And they say that it's the inheritance of memory that makes us who we are. It's what we remember, that creates the past that we have. And it's this other, and they do it perfectly scientifically. It's not as if this is some quack religious guy. They're actually scrupulously scientific. They follow rigorous statistical methods. They compile this massive database, and they also create these links which are not the usual scientific links of the Cold War, which go towards the Soviet Union or towards the US, but it goes to Turkey, it goes to Lebanon, it goes to South Africa, it goes to Nigeria, and it's this other constellation that tries to think of human difference in terms of this model of a non-material selfhood that I'm really interested in. So here is a Igbo shrine, and you can see there's a European-looking guy with a top hat who's an ancestor, and it can only work again because of this notion of rebirth. So what I want to leave you with is that I think many of our stories of genetics today have a notion of an implicit idea of almost inevitability, as if we were just bound to end up here, that this is the only way to think of human difference. But there was, at least briefly in the 60s and 70s, another way, an attempt to think of human difference through a paradigm that was radically non-somatic, that emphasized memory and cultural affiliations, and that was also accepted as being a kind of science. It was in universities. And so we don't have to go outside of science to find alternatives. There were alternatives within science, but unfortunately this was also a child of the Cold War, and it vanished with the Berlin Wall, perhaps. So sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prajit. So our next paper is co-authored by João Bastos, who is an associate professor at the Department of Public Health in the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil, and also Ricardo Ventura Santos, who is a professor at the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for Dorothy and Aaron for inviting me and the whole group. And it's very nice to be here. My very dear friend, Susan Lindy, and Rosanna Dent, also with whom I have been cooperating over the years. And also for the opportunity that João is also here for this conference. Okay. So upon beginning the reflections for writing this essay, João Bastos and I had the feeling that the title of this panel, Purity and Mixture, evoked something we did not identify at first. Until at one point, we thought of a parallel with the title of the famous book, Purity and Danger, an analysis of concepts of pollution and taboo by English cultural anthropologist Mary Douglas, published nearly 50 years ago in 1966. Purity and Danger is a work that focuses on the theme of religion and became a classic in anthropology. To a large extent, this happened because several notions investigated by Douglas, such as pollution, transcended the limits of the uses in the book itself and began to be applied to reflections on a great variety of social dynamics. In a well-known passage, the anthropologist wrote, and I quote, "As we know it, dirt is essentially disorder. There is no such thing as absolute dirt. It exists in the eye of the beholder." End of quote. We would like to argue that Douglas insights that notions such as disorder and dirt, as well as its counterpart purity, are historic and social cultural constructs, might help us to reflect on the issues we will address in this presentation. At first, distant from the ethnographic context that inspired purity and danger, we will describe and contextualize two contemporary case studies from Brazil in which, using an expression by Hartingen, and I quote, "race is currently gaining in reality," end of quote. The first relates to the implementation of public policies aimed at increasing access to higher education among African Brazilian students, in which defining the classification of color or race has led to the creation of race classification boards in Brazil. And these race classification boards, the aim is to confirm the candidates' self-declarations of ethno-racial belonging. The second, at the interface between biomedical studies, race, and genomics, is linked to recent initiatives to investigate the relationship between genetic ancestry and self-classified color and race, under which biological criteria are activated, or at least alluded to, as potentially useful to solve what are seen as classificatory difficulties stemming from the fluidity of ethno-racial classification in Brazil. So we argue that in both case studies, the eyes of the beholder, that is, those who have the authority to define the classification, moves from the individual experiencing the classificatory process to something or someone external to the individual. This is expressed in the paradoxical circumstance that self-classification undergoes a process of confirmation that is foreign to the subject. So, this past February, 2 months ago, the official website of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, one of the most prestigious higher education institutions in Brazil, published a note on the procedures that must be undertaken to ascertain the racial classification of those students applying for the racial quotas. The note states, "For Black and brown students, the evaluation will be effective through the verification that the students concerned is seen socially as a member of the racial group to which he or she declared that she belonged based on his or her phenotype. Apart from the skin color, other characteristics will be taken into account, such as hair type, shape of nose, and lips. The procedure is silent, and the candidate will not be interviewed," end of quote. The Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul case is just one among numerous Brazilian higher education institutions which, over the past few years, implemented a quota system that follows ethno-racial and socioeconomic criteria according to a federal law of 2012, the so-called quotas law. This law is part of a broader legal framework that was established in Brazil throughout the last 2 decades, aiming at fighting racism. During the first few years of the promulgation of this quotas law, the selection procedures that happened at dozens of the existing federal institutions were primarily based on the self-declarations of color or race. However, over time, as you may see in this figure, so each orange circle is institutions that are currently implementing this kind of boards. So over time, many institutions began to establish their own race classification boards. Defended and supported by sectors of the social movements, such commissions have been justified on the grounds that many candidates who are applying for the spots would be cheating in their statement of racial belonging so as to benefit from the quota system. This matter gained such a degree of political importance that the federal government issued what they called a guidance policy in 2016, defining, and I quote, "rules for measuring the truth self-declarations provided by Black candidates," end of quote. As can be imagined, the creation of these commissions have generated heated debate both in academic forums and in society in general, ranging from positions of fierce criticism to those of extreme support. It's worth noting that even the sectors that are most favorable towards the implementation of the racial quotas, as in the case of the Black movement leaders, the narrative is that these commissions are a necessary evil. Necessary evil is an expression that they use, actually. The second case study is also closely related to racial classification procedures. We will focus on a specific example that we argue might be seen as representative of a much broader context of increasing use of information about genetic ancestry in population health research in Brazil. Specifically, we will address a recently published investigation entitled, that's the title of the publication, Genomic Ancestry and Ethno-Racial Self-Classification Based on 5,000 plus Community Dwellings Brazilians, that was published by this EpiGen initiative, that I'm gonna talk a little bit about it later on. So this article was based on data from 3 of the leading ongoing cohorts, that you can see on the map, the cohort studies, on the health of human populations in Brazil. And according to the authors of this paper, and I quote, the composition of the Brazilian population is mixed, and its ethno-racial classification is complex. Previous studies showed conflicting results on the correlation between genome ancestry and ethno-racial classifications in Brazilians, end of quote. So this study should be briefly situated in the more general scenario of research on population genetics and public health in Brazil. In the context of Latin America, Brazil has a singular trajectory concerning the history of human population genetics, which was established and expanded from the 1950s onwards through a complex network of exchange between Brazilian and foreign researchers, mostly from the US. And as Rosana Dent and I, we have recently argued, since its beginning, in addition to research on indigenous populations, a recurring theme has been to investigate through genetic markers what scientists have called, and I quote, the biological processes involved in the formation of the Brazilian population, end of quote, focusing on analyzing the differential contributions of the genetic pool of population of European, African, and Amerindian origins. I mean, the theme of mestiçage, of course. So this research agenda related to what we would call bio-narratives about the nation was maintained and updated with the expansion of research based on genomic markers that began in the 1990s, some 30 years ago. In this scenario, a specific theme grew in the agenda of population genetics research in Brazil. Studies focusing on the interrelationship between color and race classification and the genomic profiles of individuals. So in recent years, some of the major cohort studies on human health in the country, such as those associated with this EpiGen initiative, have strongly emphasized genomics. So as stated in their website, and I quote, the EpiGen Brazil initiative is so far the largest Latin American initiative, always competing with Mexico, of course, in population genomics and genetic epidemiology. It aims to study the association between genetic variants found in the Brazilian population and complex disease, end of quote. As in previous periods of human population genetic research, the question of mestiçage remains a central aspect in the justifications currently presented by geneticists and now by epidemiologists. According to the EpiGen scientists, the project aims at taking into account one of the most important characteristics of the Brazilian population, its admixture. It's so interesting because this goes back, of course, to the 19th century, I mean, this emphasis. So in this scenario, we would like to argue that genomic ancestry and ethno-racial classification, this example, is very illustrative of the complex exchanges present in debates on color, on race or color classification in genomics in current epidemiological research in Brazil. The focus remains on mestiçage, but other elements come into play, particularly the emphasis on what we would call the individualization of the classification process. Genomic ancestry and ethno-racial self-classification and other recent studies exercise beyond an exercise of comparing classification systems in the bigger it goes beyond the exercise of comparing classification system. I'm sorry. In the bigger picture, what's at stake is the search for a classificatory criteria considering the eyes of the scientists as objective and reproducible. So not only emphasizing what the debate, that the debate over whether ethno-racial self-classification with ancestry has policy implication, geneticists in epidemiology, as argued in another recent publication, which has this very assertive title, Biogeographical Ancestry is associated with socioeconomic conditions, socio-environmental conditions, and infections in great Latin American urban populations. And in this paper, it was just published actually, I will read a small quote from that. They say, self-reported skin color in Brazil has traditionally been used in epidemiological studies. The advent of genotyping technologies has enabled to estimate the geographic origins of one ancestors. This approach provides a more objective estimate of the ancestral origins of individuals than self-reported skin color. Well, today, Brazil is going through a significant social and ideological reconfiguration in which the theme of mestiçage has been increasingly displaced from the center of the nation-state pantheon of symbols, as this image suggests, to say the least. At the risk of an oversimplification and schematization of greatly complex historical and social-political processes, perhaps not completely inaccurate to affirm that from the beginning of the 20th century to the present, Brazil has experienced the three moments pertaining to the role and valuation of mestiçage. Since the late 19th century until about the early 1930s, when the ideologies of racial determinism impregnated by eugenic perspectives were commonplace, mestiçage was perceived as an evil to be cut off from the nation, with the whitening of the population assumed to be the route to be taken for national redemption. With the cultural turn of the 1930s, which had one of its synthesis, the work of the sociologist Gilberto Freire, mestiçage became valued to the point that it turned into a national symbol of major prominence. In the most recent phase, over the past 2 decades, mestiçage became again associated with a negative connotation, to a large extent seen as supporting notions of racial democracy that prevailed in the country during most of the 20th century. In the current Brazil of racial quotas, the emphasis is on the white-black polarity. The mestiço, previously a symbol of the nation, becomes increasingly an element of noise which pollutes the system in a way. Both situations that we consider in this paper have the common background of the growing prominence of the ethno-racial dimension in public policy debates in Brazil. Being the implementation of quotas or in scientific practice, at stake are the continuous and complex dilemma of making up people, about which speaks Hacking. A common issue is the establishment of infrastructures of classification through which, as noted by Mara Loveman in her recent book, National Colors, Racial Classification and the State in Latin America, in which she wrote, directly and acutely, particular categories are attached to individual bodies and used to structure administrative allocation or other dimensions of lived experience, end of quote. While defended by segments of social movements, the existence of race classification boards produced discomfort for many scholars. In particular, historians, anthropologists, and sociologists see similarities between the classification procedures and those used during the strongest moment of scientific racism, from the end of the 19th century to the mid-20th century. Ironically, even though there is not a deeper historical criticism in the institutional frameworks for the current classification procedures, the actions are seen as a way to implement a public policy towards promoting equity. Those who support the commissions argue, for example, if in everyday relationships, the bodies of blacks, individually or collectively, are constantly racially marked and classified in Brazil by the police, at bank entrance, etc., why cannot the same be done for the purpose of public policies that attempt to reduce inequities? As one might imagine, the degree of controversy associated with the use of genomic criteria to define racial classification in biomedical research in Brazil is not even remotely close to the debate about the racial quotas. This, despite the subject in itself carry elements that refer to important debates between the social and human science and biomedicine, in particular, the use of biological criteria in the definition of social identities. In the broader context of knowledge production and use of genetic science in Brazil and beyond, the fact is that the prospect of using genomic methods to infer on the physical characteristics of individuals, as in the case of missing and absent people, as Ahmad has shown, is widespread, as in forensics genetic routines. In this sense, the Brazilian research that we refer to in this text could be seen as a kind of racial profiling. One particularity is that in the example of the Brazilian research that we refer to, the individuals are not missing or absent. I mean, they're not suspect or victims. It is his or her subjectivity that produces form of classification that are not reliable or reproducible within the expected canons in some fields of science, and biomedicine in particular. So moving to the conclusion. Well, borrowing the subtitle of Insightful Test by Ahmad, the two case studies exploring this paper make us reflect on the materiality of race in practice in contemporary Brazil. Despite different in many ways, they involve processes that seek the normalization and stabilization of identity categories. In both instances, those who experience the classification rights face eyes of the beholders that, however different they may be, start from the position of questioning how individual subjectivities conceive their respective selves. In the classification exercise that might often be confrontational, the eyes of the beholder pass from a regime of him, herself, and about him, herself, to one of the other and about the other. It involves a deep reconfiguration and repositioning of the gaze with authority to define who is who. In addition, being the daily lives of the racial classification boards or genomic sequencing to determine biological ancestries, continuing fluidity often regarded as hallmarks of Brazilian culture and society, are questioned. Instead, the polarities of white, not white, and black, not black, increasingly prevail in justifications, narrative, and practices associated with the implementation of a broad range of public policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. So our final speaker is Vivek Garcia Deister, who is an associate professor in science and technology studies at the School of Social Sciences at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM.
Thank you, Sebastián, and our marvelous organizers. I'm so honored to be here. A quick correction, I'm not at the School of Social Sciences, I'm at the School of Sciences, more specifically in the biology department in the STS lab. I have two main research lines. One is race, genetics, and admixture in Mexico. The other is the configuration of forensic genetics in contemporary Mexico. What I will be speaking about today falls within the first line of research. I am interested in how ideas about nation and mixture both inform and are informed by genomics research. So let us begin. I trust that many of you are familiar with this face. This is Nobel Prize winner, literature Nobel Prize winner Octavio Paz. Since Octavio Paz's El laberinto de la soledad, published in 1950, Mexican intellectuals have devoted time and effort to figuring out the physical, idiosyncratic, and psychological traits of El Mexicano. These authors have new interlocutors. From their sanitized laboratories and national institutes of health, biomedical researchers have joined the ranks of those committed to singling out the potentialities, dispositions, and weaknesses of El Mexicano. If he was one condemned by intellectuals, today he is condemned by scientists. El Mexicano is not only the ill-fated child of La Chingada, he is also prone to obesity and diabetes. Just like his temperament was theorized by Paz himself to reflect a traumatic origin, this bodily trait, scientists suggest, is also a result of the collision of La Conquista. Allow me to illustrate my point. In 2010, Mexico celebrated 100 years since the revolution and 200 years since its independence from Spain. That same year, the World Health Organization issued a report that positioned Mexico in the second highest rate of overweight and obesity and identified type 2 diabetes as the second cause of death in the country. The idea that a mixture between Spaniards and Native Americans 500 years ago gave rise to Mexicans' increased susceptibility to obesity and diabetes was paramount to the Bicentenary celebrations. A series of ads sponsored by the federal government and featuring the ubiquitous Bicentenary logo, which we see here, covered newsstands all over historic downtown Mexico City with messages about diabetes prevention. A poster titled Bicentenary Summit of Diabetes, Nutrition, and Obesity invited the public to gastronomic demonstrations of traditional yet healthy recipes and to conferences and workshops with nutrition specialists and medical doctors. It was no coincidence that the campaign against obesity and diabetes was synchronized with a commemoration of two sources of national identity, the Mexican independence and the revolution. Since, judging by the statistics, besides being mestizos and probably on account of mestizaje, Mexicans are also obese and diabetic. As a strategy for promoting national pride, the federal government celebrated mestizo identity and at the same time issued an alert about its adverse consequences. 3 years later, in 2013, Mexico surpassed the United States as the most obese nation, and diabetes today is the leading cause of death in the Mexican population. The incidence of this disease is so high and it is responsible for so many deaths that in November 2016, the Secretary of Health declared the diabetes epidemic a national emergency, the first time this has happened in the absence of an infectious disease. The Secretary of Health has turned to biomedical researchers and geneticists for an explanation and a possible solution to this public health crisis that costs the Mexican state an annual $7.7 billion. In this context, explanations that account for the high incidence of obesity and diabetes as a legacy of mestizaje have become salient and significantly funded, to the detriment, of course, of explanations that look into the social determinants of disease. So the Mexican mestizo or mestiza, that emblematic subject that embodies both the virtues and the failings of the biological and cultural mix that took place 500 years ago, is increasingly scrutinized under the lens of propensity or resistance to disease. When the hypothesis regarding Mexican people's susceptibility to disease converges with the founding myth of the Mexican nation, that is, that we are all descendants of a Spanish father and an indigenous mother, the genome of Mexicans becomes not only a historic repository, but also an epidemiological record. With bioinformatics tools, researchers identify in the genomes of the Mexican mestizo population the European and Native American portions, and among the latter, they seem to have located gene variants that confer an increased risk of diabetes. According to a study published in 2010 by Mexico's National Institute of Medical Science and Nutrition, the Mexicans' genetic susceptibility to the development of obesity and diabetes is related to their Amerindian ancestry. A 2017 article asserts more emphatically that the genetic risk of developing type 2 diabetes increases in parallel with a proportion of Native American ancestry. So the connection between propensity to disease and Native American ancestry has become progressively more categorical. But how is the Mexican mestizo population configured as an object of study? The former Director General of Mexico's National Institute for Genomic Medicine repeatedly stated that Mexicans have, quote, a unique genetic makeup and a characteristic set of disease susceptibilities, which resulted from an admixture of more than 65 native Indian groups with Spaniards. Thus, the work of many biomedical geneticists stems from the thesis that Mexican mestizos are genetically unique, and that this can be attributed to the nation's particular demographic history, when at some point pure units of Europeans and Native Americans met, the result of which gave rise to both a distinctive national type and a public health crisis. This imaginary of uniqueness in which mixture occupies center stage nevertheless evokes notions of purity, for as Peter Wade notes, in Mexico the idea of national genetic particularity depended on an unspoken but self-evident evolutionary narrative that saw Amerindians as a continental isolate unlike any others. This means that Mexico's Native American past is glorified as a source of biocultural purity and genetic uniqueness, while the traces of this past detectable today by genomics tools in specific portions of the admixed genome are understood to make Mexicans distinctively pathological and especially prone to diabetes. Thus, a tension arises between purity as propensity to disease and mixture as the condition in which disease is instantiated, one that underpins the search for type 2 diabetes in the genome. One of this effort's main actors is the SLIM Initiative for Genomic Medicine for the Americas, or SIGMA. This is a joint US-Mexico project funded by the Carlos Slim Health Institute that focuses on key diseases with particular relevance to public health in Mexico and Latin America. SIGMA's first results of their investigations into Mexicans' elevated risk of developing diabetes, published in Nature in 2014, navigate this tension by stressing that despite being common in Native American populations, a newly identified genetic risk factor, a gene variant they called SLC16A11, is, I quote, largely absent in African populations and rare in Europeans, while the higher risk form of the gene has been found in up to half of people who have recent Native American ancestry. So the differential presence of this gene variant in the populations corresponding to each element of the trihybrid model of admixture, which we see here between African, European, and Native Americans or Amerindians. In other words, the absence in African populations establishes in a single step the link between Mexicans' Native American ancestry and their propensity to diabetes, all without renouncing the mythical uniqueness of that mixture, that is, that we are much more Native American than African. In fact, the erasure of African ancestry was methodologically buttressed during the investigation. A Mexico-based scientist who participated in SIGMA acknowledged the elimination of any samples found to have high African ancestry. Let me see if this is the marker. Which might be the marker. So any samples of allegedly Mexican mestizos who fall closer to the African side are eliminated as outliers, and the sample population is constructed statistically as the one that falls between the Amerindian and European cline. So she acknowledged the elimination of any samples found to have high African ancestry, which is widely understood to be a smaller component of the region's supposed trihybrid admixture. A statement included in Sigma's 2014 Nature paper was the fact that the SLC16A11 variant was found to be present in a newly sequenced Neanderthal genome. Analysis indicate, read the Broad Institute's press release, that the higher risk version of LSC16A11 was introduced into modern humans through mixing with Neanderthal. Despite the fact that both in paper and when interviewed, Sigma scientists dismissed the interpretation that people with diabetes or people with Native American ancestry have an excess of Neanderthal DNA relative to other populations, the media was quick to establish the Neanderthal connection to Native American ancestry and disease. Indeed, even though a co-author of the paper called this a collateral and somewhat circumstantial finding, and Harvard geneticist and co-corresponding author David Altshuler told NPR that the Neanderthal connection is interesting, but it is not the essence of this work. Ricky Lewis, a PLOS Science blogger, claimed to have unearthed the most compelling statement of the publication, that Mexicans inherited diabetes risk from Neanderthals, buried among the paragraphs. Her post is meant to call attention to the link that the science media might have missed. She said, having a bit of one's genome from a Neanderthal that predisposes to diabetes might be unexpected, but the presence of this DNA source shouldn't be stigmatizing. From 1% to 4% of many of our genomes are from Neanderthals. Sub-Saharan Africans have none. But for a disease population so scrutinized, note the Pima Indian investigations, it's surprising to find that a risk gene for diabetes traces back to this side branch from the evolutionary road leading to humanity. So notice the immediate connection that Lewis establishes between being Mexican and having substantial Native American ancestry. While in Mexico, as historian Mauricio Tenorio has argued, mestizaje has clearly functioned as an odd form of nationalism, ethnic indeed, but aiming by its own praise of mixture to overcome ethnicity with nationality. In the US, Mexicanness is clearly imbued with overt ethnic connotations, so much so that in this quote, Mexicans and Indians become virtually equivalent. This is a move that Michael Montoya calls bioethnic conscription, and is partially responsible for the observation that Mexicans have nearly twice the chance of developing diabetes than non-Hispanic white Americans do. So Lewis, like other science reporters, delivered the message that in addition to pathology being ethnically defined, humans picked up the diabetes mutations from Neanderthals 30,000 years ago or so. The new data don't mean that Neanderthals had diabetes, Altshuler was quick to point out to an NPR reporter, but the fact that this disease sequence came from then was enough to establish the link between primitiveness or archaism, which is scientists' preferred term, and disease. The long-duret genomic narrative posits then that when modern humans left Africa between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago and arrived in Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthals were already living there. Those humans and Neanderthals interbred, introducing some Neanderthal DNA, including the diabetes link gene version, into the human lineage. Native Americans inherited the disadvantageous Neanderthal gene variants, which they in turn transmitted to Mexican mestizos. This demographic epidemiological narrative lends support to the link between Native American ancestry and propensity to disease, but reconfigures the imperative of purity, because even Homo sapiens is mixed with Neanderthal. As exoticism, I say. The uniqueness of the Mexican population and its amplified susceptibility to diabetes. This increased visibilization of Mexicans as both exceptionally diseased and understudied parallels the expansion of the technologies, genomics technologies in this case, that renders them exotic. So Native American ancestry is constantly invoked in genomic explanations of the increased risk of type 2 diabetes in the Mexican population. The ongoing search for the genetic basis of this disease is justified as a means for eventually developing improved risk assessment and therapeutic interventions, which could dramatically reduce the cost of managing the health crisis in Mexico. By looking at some of the results of this research agenda, I showed that in genomic narratives of disease in Mexico, notions of purity, Native American ancestry, and primitiveness become entangled. And when strung together, these notions reinforce the idea that Mexicans are different, distinctively pathological, and especially prone to diabetes. Scientists navigate the tension between purity as propensity to disease and mixture as the condition in which disease is instantiated by two things. One, by interpreting the presence of risk gene variants in light of the trihybrid model of admixture, yet without renouncing the bihybrid founding myth of the Mexican nation. And two, by reconfiguring the imperative of purity with exoticism derived from the Neanderthal connection. The link between the primitive and the pathological becomes all the more persuasive when the results of these investigations are refracted through the lens of US racial categories. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for a wonderful set of papers, and thank you to Dorothy and Iram for this invitation to comment and engage with the work of both near and distant colleagues. I wanted to begin by saying that I think one of the things that these papers really highlight and do a really wonderful job of showing us is how, when we turn to the global, we are presented with a really sort of unexpected set of sites and objects and also politics. So I think that's a real strength of all of the paper, you know, sort of the unexpected places and sites and actors that they introduce us to. So what I want to do is to try to pull out some common themes from all of the papers, and then say a few things about the individual papers and some sort of impressions and questions that they raise. So one of the kind of themes that I was struck by, and that I think speaks to kind of the prompt for the panel, is what I'm calling epistemic purity in response to ongoing and increasing racial mixture and complexity. So I thought in several ways, a lot of these papers were dealing with or kind of presenting us with examples of how, in the face of sort of the messiness of race and the kind of the messiness of racial mixing, the response of various different kinds of actors is to kind of look for a kind of epistemic purity, to kind of attempt to sort of purify their epistemic categories and find, you know, very sort of specific and precise markers or practices by which they might make sense of you know, all this sort of racial disorder. So the other kind of theme that I think is related to this one is the theme of categorical alignment. So this is a term that some of you might be familiar with from the work of the sociologist Stephen Epstein. Stephen Epstein, in his 2007 book Inclusion, developed the concept of categorical alignment to describe the process in which health reformers in the US sought to merge social categories from the worlds of biomedicine, social movements, and state administration. So he developed the concept as a way of describing the kind of political work that's done in order to kind of bring categories from different worlds into alignment, and particularly in the context of biomedicine. So I thought that, you know, this kind of, there was different processes of categorical alignment at play in all of these papers, and with sort of differing politics. So in Ricardo and Joao's paper, we see two very different sets of actors with different social interests who are similarly engaging in an attempt to bring ethno-racial classifications into alignment with phenotypic traits, administrative categories, and genomic markers. And I thought Vivette's paper also presented a fascinating example of how within the national frame of Mexico, mestizaje gets aligned with a national identity, while from the vantage point of the US, it gets aligned with indigeneity. So we also see how kind of that process of categorical alignment plays out differently in different national frames. And Prajit's paper reveals the ways in which missing foreskins have been tasked with, given the burden of bringing racial and religious identities into alignment. So how, a missing body part is asked to do a whole lot of epistemic work. So these are some things that I'm putting out there so that we can think about as we open things up to discussion. I did have a few individual comments for the papers, so I'm going to go in order that they were presented in. So for Prajit's paper, one of the things I found the most striking is how you were bringing a very different set of actors together and showing how they were united by an interest in a shared object. So I wanted to invite you to say a bit more about how and why missing foreskins became an object of study for these disparate set of actors, these different epistemic communities, and to say a bit more about the styles of thought or the research programs or even technical systems that they brought to bear on these questions and prompted their interest in this very specific marker. So I think for maybe a lot of us, the research agendas of the geneticists that you described are more familiar and we know from a lot of what we've heard today that they would have been very much interested in kind of the evolutionary history of the human species and as you mentioned, isolates as a kind of window into that process. But I wanted to know more about these other actors who some of us might be less familiar with, the colonial physicians and the parapsychologists, and sort of what their guiding research questions is and what their kind of conception of human history or human evolution is. So, I mean, from the parapsychologists, we learned that that the cases of congenital circumcision became really useful foils for attacking kind of the materialist and Mendelian assumptions of geneticists. But what I wanted to know more of is, what was their sort of conception of human evolution? And here I wondered if there might be a kind of another ghost in your story, the ghost of Alfred Russel Wallace, who rejected the notion that natural selection applied full stop to humans, and that there was kind of some extra something exceptional about humans that exempted them from the processes of natural selection. And then the other comment I wanted to make on Prajit's paper is I wanted to invite you to consider another set of actors that I think could plausibly figure within your story. And here I'm thinking about the work of cultural anthropologists. If you do sort of a cursory search on what cultural anthropologists have said about circumcision, you'll find that they've written a lot about it. And so there's an extensive literature that dates back to the late 19th century, and one of the most prominent cultural anthropologists in debates concerning the ethics of circumcision is also somebody who is highly prominent in debates concerning the scientific basis of race. And so this is the anthropologist Ashley Montagu. Not only did Montagu publish extensive critiques of the race concept and leave his stamp on the 1950 and 1951 UNESCO statements on race, but he also led a quite aggressive campaign against circumcisions of all kinds and labeled them sexual mutilations that dehumanize people by robbing them of sort of crucial sensory structures of their anatomy and deprive them of pleasure. And in 1996, anti-circumcision activists and scientists brought a petition to the World Court in The Hague, which they called the Ashley Montagu Resolution to end the genital mutilation of children worldwide. If you go back and look at Ashley Montagu's sort of earlier work in the 1940s, he was writing about what he called sexual mutilation as kind of a marker of primitiveness, of something that the literature on Aboriginals in Australia is all over the place in this. So I think that could be sort of an interesting place to look to kind of expand. So I want to move on to Ricardo and Joao's paper, In the Eye of the Beholder. And in this paper, I was also struck by the way you found a kind of a common theme or kind of common agenda underlying two very different projects and different sets of actors. So in this case, the self-declaration verification boards and the genomic scientists. So I thought you made really convincing arguments about how both of these projects seem to devalue both mestizaje and racial self-identification. But I wonder if it's also worth considering some of the differences between these two projects. What struck me is, I mean, I was trying to kind of think about what are the kind of underlying assumptions of these two projects. And in the case of the verification boards, it seems that one of the kind of underlying assumptions is that there's a kind of tacit social contract with respect to what constitutes blackness and whiteness, and that those who are committing fraud, those who are cheating, are kind of betraying that sort of tacit social consensus. There seems to be the suggestion here that there is already kind of an implicit and hidden taxonomy in place in Brazilian society, and that what these boards are seeking to do is to kind of make it explicit. And as you mentioned, this is very much driven by the social movements, from recent years. So I was really, I have a ton of questions about these boards and kind of their relationship to the social movements. But I thought maybe one kind of way to get at what's going on here, or to kind of prompt you to say some more, is to think about the question of racial consciousness. So sort of my understanding of the role that Black social movements have played in kind of critiques of racial democracy is that, they've mobilized or kind of pointed to racial democracy as a kind of discourse that doesn't allow for the formation of a kind of Black social consciousness. That, because of racial democracy celebrates racial mestizaje and suggests that there aren't these sort of clear-cut categories, that then it becomes very difficult to kind of mobilize a politics of Blackness. And that, so my understanding of at least sort of earlier versions of Black social movements is that they were about kind of attempting to introduce a kind of Black racial consciousness. So I'm wondering what happens here then in the case of these boards, which are explicitly sort of where the interviews are silent and where self-identification is met with distrust. Where does, I guess, consciousness figure into these projects? And I guess generally I just want to hear more about how the social movements are thinking about these boards. And then I guess in the case of the epigen studies, I wondered if there was a kind of different sort of underlying assumption or kind of a different epistemic move that was made. And it seems that whereas, the verification board sort of assumed that there is a kind of tacit social understanding of what constitutes blackness and whiteness, what the epigen studies are doing is putting their faith and trust in numbers. That that it's about establishing a sort of a sufficiently robust data set that will allow them to kind of correlate ethno-racial classifications with genomic ancestry. So I guess what I'm wondering is, are there maybe kind of different conceptions of objectivity at play here? So those are the kinds of questions that your paper prompted. And then in Vivette's paper, I really loved that opening hook where you're kind of inviting us to think about genomic scientists as following in the footsteps of these literary figures like Octavio La Paz, and I was really fascinated by the way in which they're kind of invoking the colonial history of Mexico as a way of kind of framing their studies. But then as we sort of delved deeper into the kind of the nitty-gritty details of the studies, it seemed as if that kind of the colonial history that was originally invoked gets expanded into a very different sort of temporality, very different time scale. Then we learn about kind of the Neanderthal sort of basis of these markers, and so I guess what I'm wondering here is, how are genomic scientists, I guess, bringing these kind of different temporalities or these kind of different histories, how are they bringing them together or not? And I guess what kinds of interventions do these kind of analyses that evoke these kind of primordial temporalities, what kind of interventions do they suggest on the basis of this? Just as a kind of concluding thought, I thought there was a kind of an interesting nod to diet and nutrition as a kind of means of tackling the obesity problem, and I wondered, to what extent the kind of attention to diet and nutrition and sort of nutritional expertise brings into play a kind of different biohistorical narrative, and here I'm kind of thinking about some of the work that early modern historians of the conquest have done on the role played by diet and food in the Iberian conquest of the Americas. So there's a wonderful piece by a historian named Rebecca Earle called "If You Eat Their Food," that really unpacks the way in which early Iberian colonizers were incredibly anxious about being in the New World and were fearful of becoming like indigenous groups, and thought that by importing sort of European foods and recreating kind of European diet and nutrition in the New World, they would and prevent themselves from becoming indigenous. So I mean, are these also kind of, I guess, tapping into very long-standing colonial anxieties? Okay, and at this point, I will turn things over to all of you.
If there are any questions for the panelists, please ask them now. Sebastian also has a number. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much for the panel. I really enjoyed the papers. And I just have a question for Vivette, a really great study. I'm wondering if there are any alternative explanations sort of circulating in the public about the increase in diabetes, such as like political economy, given the way in which the North American Free Trade Agreement has restructured agriculture and also food consumption, and the kind of massive dumping of sugar that's taken place as a result of that. So just a quick question about like just, something outside of the realm of science and this deterministic sort of, explanation.
So I can answer directly from here, correct? Okay. Thank you for that question. Actually, that sort of relates to one of the points of that Sebastian was making about diet and lifestyle. Interestingly enough, ideas about a changing lifestyle in the Mexican population on account of NAFTA become entangled with the genomic search for type 2 diabetes. So on several levels. So one level is the ubiquitous yet scientifically not very solid thrifty gene hypothesis, which claims that we used to be nomads and we used to be to gather food for when we had a famine. So there was an alternative setting between feast and famine. So during feast, we feast on food, so we prepare for famine. And now that we have all this food available to us, and we are no longer eating as our indigenous ancestors ate, but we are drinking Coca-Cola and eating McDonald's, then we become obese and diabetic. So at another level, there has been significant political turmoil regarding the availability of junk food in schools available to children. So there are lobbyists who are trying to prevent this from happening. They're supporting a reform in the law system to prevent this food from being available, while Coca-Cola and other big food industry lobbyists are pushing for election as, choice as something that people should have. And in the process of doing that, Coca-Cola Foundation has donated millions of dollars and actual genome sequencers to laboratories who are searching for type 2 diabetes in the genome. So they're not really separate. They become entangled.
I'm not sure you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I have two questions. My first question is for Vivette. In fact, a comment and a question. Regarding the Neanderthal, my name is Ambrose, I'm a geneticist. Regarding the Neanderthal genes, or so-called traits in human, a little bit to balance, we know amongst European and Asian, there's also the same type of proportion that have recently been associated maybe to the propensity of having more depression or something like that as compared like to African where there is none of that. Is this type of narrative also arriving in Mexico? So the second is relative to diabetes and the environment, not genes. In South Africa, I'm from South Africa, we have the same problem with obesity and diabetes mellitus, that is now #1 killer of women in South Africa, but we don't have Neanderthal genes. So yes, trace, exactly. I do think we really need, I think the public discourse needs to balance between really the impact of genetics and environment. Is probably more environmental condition than a genetic condition. Maybe the comment on schizophrenia and depression might be very interesting to us to know if there is also such comment in the public discourse. My second question is for Projit. Yeah, in your missing skin a story, I think there is a major missing link. I would like you to comment on that. Is the ritual circumcision have been practiced in Africa for more than 1,000 years. What is the link between that and the so-called origin of ritual circumcision from Asia or Jewish ancestry? I believe Jewish people live in Africa for at least 500 years before moving back, from 70 people of 12 family to nearly 500,000 before Moses sent them back. Okay, so I think that there is a missing link in that story, specifically the ritual circumcision in people of African ancestry. I would like a comment on that. My third question is for Yao and Ricardo. So that is also regarding genetic and so-called ethnicity and admixture, specifically Brazilian population. One of my interests is sickle cell anemia. My major interest, so I have a lot of collaboration with Brazilian. From what I understand, if you perform ethnic screening, base screening of genetic variant according to population, you will find like sickle cell trait in white Brazilian nearly as high as cystic fibrosis that was supposed to label a kind of white recessive condition. I would like some comment on that with regard to anthropology and sociology in Brazil. Mm-hmm.
Should I begin? So, despite the epidemic of obesity and diabetes being construed as a particularly Mexican phenomenon, I think there is a wide array of data to posit it as a global phenomenon. What we are looking at is a public health research agenda that is, I think, is overlooking other determinants of disease, even though they acknowledge that diabetes is a multifactorial disease. But the objective is to find that single bullet, the silver bullet. No, if we can identify a gene variant, then we can locate, so to speak, the origins of the disease. In Mexico, scientists claim to have found gene variants specific to the Mexican mestizo population that account for schizophrenia as well. So I don't think this is particular to the nation. I think that if we look at the context in many different nations, we will find that this is constantly replicated. So what is the specificity of it? I'm not sure. I think it might be construed. That's it for me, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. It is a bit of a ghost because it keeps cropping up, the whole idea of ritual circumcision in Africa, particularly because one of the guys I mentioned, Theodore James, who writes quite a bit about this, he's actually South African. He trains in Britain but then goes back to South Africa, and he writes a lot. And I think this goes back to Sebastian's question about cultural anthropology as well. At this moment, there is a kind of loop between cultural anthropology and medicine. And I'm interested also, I think it still goes on in some ways, and as I listen to these conversations about these ways in which culture gets translated into biology, and we keep finding new models of trying to do that. Like, oh, it's not about the genes, but it's about the diet, and it effectively plays out in the same way. So as a South Asian male, I'm more prone to get diabetes, but you can tell me that, oh, it's not because of this, but because you guys have a lot of starch in your food. And so it effectively, I think that we have a number of these models of how culture gets translated into somatic things, and that partly that was happening in Theodore James's writings, because he's a doctor who's bringing in some of this ritual circumcision but then trying to link it back to recessive genes and stuff as well. There's also another phenomena happening here, which is that I think, again, going back to Sebastian's question, suggestion of using categorical alignment, there are many different practices that are called circumcision. And they're quite different practices, depending on what age it's done in, how it's done, what part of the skin is taken off. And those are all, they come to be, so there's a global object created called circumcision at one point. And if you actually concentrate on the rituals and actually who's doing what to whom at what age and exactly what bit of skin is being taken off, there are a multiplicity of, you can make up many categories. So they're making up one object, and then they're trying to find a mechanism which actually is very reminiscent of some of these recent ways in which, say, discourses about diet or cultural practices. I mean, for instance, there's this other one in Britain about how South Asian families, particularly Muslim families, get more rickets in the 1950s because the women are not allowed to go out much, and so they don't get enough sunlight. So, there are all kinds of ways in which they'll find a way of translating culture into biology. And that's I think, something that continues, and we sometimes feel that that is more progressive than the genetic one. But I feel it's like equally reductionist as it plays out.
Well, thank you very much for the two concepts, the epistemic purity and the categorical alignment. I think would be very useful to rethink some of our ideas. And a point that you raise is about the two very different projects. They certainly, these are very different projects. And so our idea was kind to establish this parallel. And that's quite interesting. It was not very explicit in the presentation, but that's in the paper. So, for example, in terms of the genomic use for how social epidemiology, and I find that quite scary, actually, that social epidemiologists are starting to use these technologies instead of based on self-classification, because it has a huge implication, for example, in terms of studying violence or studying, for example, indigenous population in northeastern Brazil, which, I mean, the whole thing about biology has a very complex history that goes back 500 years. So you will never be able to read indigenousness through genomics, of course. So it's really very complicated. But for example, I think one of the, we could think about in terms of genomic research and trying to use these genomic tools. There is Shirley, she was mentioned about warfarin, and I think warfarin is a very interesting case study because I participated in a research that interviewed one of the major cancer researchers in Brazil that was involved in this multi-sided warfarin studies to study the algorithm. And one of the issues that he raised is that those, the Brazilian samples that were labeled mixed, or pardos or brown, they were not incorporated into those data banks. I mean, they only would take the white and the black. So, I mean, the whole thing about the political economy of knowledge production and the political economy, which samples really became valued in this international circulation, in this international collaboration is a very important issue. So at the same time, we could see that lots that's going on in terms of public policies at these days in Brazil relate to this reinforcement of black and white. So, for example, international foundations like Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, have been very important in funding the social movements in Brazil, of course. So these ideas about the public policies in terms of white or non-white and the message has become very central. In terms of sickle cell anemia, it's a very interesting question because, I mean, 20 years ago, as in the US in the 1960s, as far as maybe a comparison could be made, sickle cell anemia became very central to the debates about the health of black populations in Brazil. 25 years ago. And actually what happened in terms of the federal public policy was that the geneticists would come and say, no, this is not a racial disease. So in terms of the implementation of the major national public policy, in terms of screening at a very early age, so sickle cell anemia was a universal genetic test was applied to all Brazilian baby newborns. So it was very interesting that at this moment, the alignment between scientists and the social movement, which was very strong at that point, actually, but one of the major arguments of the black movement in terms of the sickle cell anemia to be placed at this very special place in terms of thinking about the health of black populations in Brazil was kind of undermined by the geneticists somehow. So it's a very, I mean, it's a very complex and actually under-researched topic that really demands quite a lot of attention. So, would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe. Thank you for your comments, Sebastian, and for your comments too from the audience. I just would like to add that even though these two projects, they are together in our paper because they aim at classifying people in a valid and reliable way, we also acknowledge that they have many differences between each other. For example, the classification boards, the race classification boards, they rely on the eyes of people who are part of these boards, and these people are from the community, they are people who are employed at the university, and people even from the black movement in Brazil. While the race classification boards, they rely on people to perform the classification of candidates. These studies in the field of epidemiology, they rely on genomic data through the concept of geographical ancestry in order to classify their subjects. So these are very different from each other, of course. The race classification boards, they work differently according to the university in which they operate. It varies a lot from region to region, from city to city. But for example, while at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, which was the case in our presentation, they don't interview the candidate. In other institutions, they might ask questions such as, what does make you feel as a black person? Why did you choose to apply for this racial quota spot? And things like that. And they develop a kind of a conversation in order to ascertain the correct classification of the candidate. And what else should I say? Well, and of course, these two classification exercises, they have different purposes, and that's also a big difference between them. So that's the only thing I would like to add to his answer. Thank you.
Well, I think this is a great panel, first of all.